thank you for joining me this evening. If you'd like to be a part of our live chat, you can head on over to darknessradio.com. There's a live free chat right on the front page. You can link in with other like-minded individuals interested in all of the fringe and unique aspects and perspectives that are shared here on Coast to Coast AM while I'm hosting. You can also find out information about my show, which can be heard Monday through Friday, 9 p.m. till midnight. We're based out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Twin Cities News Talk Station, AM 1130. You can listen to our show through the live stream on darknessradio.com, Monday through Friday, 9 to midnight Central. And then stay tuned, because right after we wrap up, George Norrie and Coast to Coast AM continues your journey into the strange and unusual world around us. That's all right on our site. While you're there, you can also check out our free archives and all of the other great information and intent that we put there on the site. In the next 3 hours, we're going to be joined by author John L. Potash. He's the author of FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. His work has been published in the Baltimore Chronicle, the City Paper, Covert Action Quarterly, Rock Creek Free Press, and Z Magazine. He lives in Baltimore, and his new book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, tells us how scores of undercover U.S. intelligence agents use drugs in the targeting of leftist leaders, from SDS to the Black Panthers, Young Lords, Latin Kings, and the Occupy movement. It also tells you how they particularly targeted leftist musicians, including John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, and Tupac Shakur, to promote drugs while later murdering them when they started sobering up and taking on more leftist activism. We've got that and so much more in store for you this evening. Open phone lines to talk to our guest will happen in hour 4. That's all right here on Coast to Coast AM. Good evening, and thank you so much for hanging in with me for the rest of the evening. My name is Dave Schrader, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Let's welcome to the show John Potash. John, thank you for being here this evening.
Thanks for having me on, Dave.
What an interesting topic. What brought your attention to this? And I mean, certainly there's a lot that's being played out in this book, and a lot of different aspects looked at. How did this come to your attention as something to start researching and opening up?
Well, I got a psych degree in my undergrad and graduated in the late 80s, and first job, the only job you can get really with a psych degree is drug and alcohol counseling. And so I was counseling people in Baltimore, and I kept hearing accounts of people, of these drug dealers, saying that they think that, the highest ups are allowing the drugs in the country or bringing the drugs into the country. Highest up meaning, U.S. intelligence or the government. And I kept hearing that over and over again, hearing more and more evidence around that, and started researching it myself, and found a lot of evidence, including, Washington Post printed that the CIA Inspector General confirmed that the CIA was trafficking cocaine into our country, and then learned the history of the opium trafficking by the wealthiest families in our country. And so I ended up, finding also this targeting of activists with the drugs. So that's part of basically what, brought me to this. I also, when I went to grad school after undergrad, I studied both counseling and sociology with a top sociology professor who kind of led me in better directions with all this to find more and more information on it all. And so I ended up documenting it all in 450 pages with 1,600 endnotes showing the government documents and all the mostly mainstream sources, but over hundreds of interviews, etc., where I found this information.
Let me ask you just straight out of the chute here. How do you have this kind of information and kind of tear the top off of this secrecy and not be fearful for your life?
Well, I am fearful, but it means a lot to me after doing this, after counseling people for over 25 years, and having people in my family that have been seriously affected by drugs. It's just very personal and very important to me. So that I'm going past the fear.
When you put together a book like this, and you know that you're going up against the government and some of the wealthiest families in the world, first of all, if this was a truth, why wouldn't they squash it? Why wouldn't they shut it down and keep it from even being released?
Well, I think they've marginalized me so much. With my first book, there's just so many ways that only one somewhat mainstream weekly, the Baltimore City Paper, published an article about my first book. and the FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, and that writer ended up losing his job, within a year, and he'd been there a number of years at the city paper in Baltimore, and so they've basically censored me from most print media. And I was lucky to get on C-SPAN, American History TV, talking about the subject, but generally I've been banned from most mainstream TV, and radio is really the only place I've gotten a lot of coverage.
Drugs as weapons against us. Who does the us in the title of this book actually represent?
Well, I think it represents what the Occupy movement calls the 99%. I think it represents most of us. Most of us in this country have family or friends that are affected by drugs, harshly, with addictions or just in a number of different ways. A number of, including myself, have tried acid and been hurt by it. I feel like my grades dropped drastically for a year after eating acid half a dozen times. And it took, a year for my grades to come back up, but it was, a scary time just for that. And then I researched the histories of a lot of these activists that were either dosed or got into drugs in other ways, and seen their behavior become very erratic when they were like some top, leaders of the anti-war movement. And it just makes me wonder how much the acid hurt them for a while until they got sobered up and, got back into better activism after that. But so it's, I think it really does represent the majority of us, left, right, whatever your politics are, it affects us. But I think most people don't like all these wars, don't like, are generally for, equal rights for most people, and are for better, work environments and for labor, causes. So I think most people are, don't want to see this happening to us. And I think the powers that be, the 1% or less than 1% that have so much power in this country, are used to using drugs in this way to gain more and more money and more power, and make it harder and harder for the majority of us.
So you think that the government and the wealthy families are actually bringing in these drugs in order as a way to control us, to keep us under their thumb, and the drug culture, though, is such a limited amount compared to the millions upon millions that live in this country that are not involved in drugs. I mean, how does that work then? How do you get people that are not into the drugs controlled as well? Is it just because those people are so affected by the friends and loved ones that are being impacted by it?
Yes, yeah, we're always affected when there's an addict in our family, but even when there's abusers in our family, it affects us. But then you also have the lighter drugs that are still problematic, like marijuana is becoming rampant. They're making that so popular, and I'm not saying it's so much of a problem, but it's causing kids to start failing classes, not do as well in school, end up a little more behind the eight ball because of it. Everyone that's trying acid or ecstasy, which is so popular in so many different cultures, is getting damaged by it, according to scientific studies, that there is some mild damage happening. And so, there's so many different recreational drugs these days. It's not just the addictive drugs such as cocaine and heroin, but it's all these drugs that are causing some problems, causing abuse issues and problems. And so I think all of that is causing us not to be able to effectively change things for the better and stop these endless wars we're involved in.
All right. Well, how do you, when you're researching for this and you're looking at all these different points, where are you getting the majority of this information from? I mean, are they credible resources?
Yeah, they're mostly mainstream, news sources. New York Times. With New York Times articles and Washington Post articles, for example, I just have to comb them very carefully, and sometimes they include the best information in the last two paragraphs. But if you look at them very carefully and get the best, facts out of them, you realize that there's a lot there. But also court documents, CIA, Freedom of Information Act documents that, forgetting the CIA documents, FBI documents, a number of court transcripts that just aren't publicized in a big way in mainstream press, loads of interviews. Some great information came from a great writer named A.E. Hotchner, who was the longtime editor for Ernest Hemingway, and he wrote a great book in the Rolling Stones, in which he says a CIA MKUltra scientist. Now, Operation MKUltra was a CIA program that most used drugs as weapons against us, and most folks happen to focus on LSD the most. But so this CIA agent named Robert Lashbrook, Hotchner says, came to London and assigned agents to put LSD in as many musicians' hands as possible in 1965. And that's what they were trying to do to get people using acid as much as possible, is give it to people, that the role models, the top musicians that would promote it, and then kids would follow suit. And I argue that was to divert them from civil rights activism, divert them from the anti-war, protests, and hurt the minds of the great musicians such as John Lennon, whose first hit of acid came from being dosed, and Mick Jagger, who was convinced to use a hit of acid by an undercover FBI agent in 1967 for the first time. And so that's some of the ways that it works, and that's some of my sources.
Well, you talk about John Lennon, of course, who came to a tragic end. You've also got guys like Mick Jagger, who are still rocking into their 70s and have had, a political indifference with the way our country is run, Britain, and different things, and they've spoken up about this. Obviously, they haven't been successful in wiping out all of the activists. Why the specific ones that have been hit? Why do you feel that they didn't go after the Mick Jaggers? I mean, that would have been Mick and Keith were obviously into the drug culture and would have been easy to eradicate.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Dave. They did target the Rolling Stones, and I argue that they scared Mick Jagger away from some of his better activism. Mick Jagger and Brian Jones. Brian Jones was the founder of the Rolling Stones, best musician in the Rolling Stones, according to most reports. And so Jones and Jagger were the most vocal against the Vietnam War. And so I showed the evidence that they were targeted with the drugs, like with that FBI undercover agent, for example. And then when Jones started to sober up, they also came down on them legally. When that FBI undercover agent gave Jagger his first hit of acid, the police then came in a few hours later and busted them and put them under the legal authorities' thumb, okay? Jones, they ended up denying Brian Jones like a visa or passport, whatever, to get out of the country in 1968, the following year. And so he had to at least temporarily separate from the Stones as the Stones went on their American tour. And Jones was left back. He sobered up, according to Hotchner. And then he called his good friend Jimi Hendrix and he called his good friend John Lennon and said, let's form a supergroup. And they tentatively agreed to that, forming a supergroup that was been very political. And then a good friend of Brian Jones named Nick Fitzpatrick, who was a member of the Guinness Beer family, was over Jones's house, and Jones sends him out to the town to get a friend and pick up a friend, and Fitzpatrick comes back from that and finds there's a party at Brian Jones's house. He wasn't supposed to have a party at that time, so he can't get in the driveway. It's blocked off. He goes around the back, and he sees someone being drowned by 3 or 4 men in a swimming pool. And someone pops out of the bushes and says, get out of here, Fitzpatrick, or you'll be next. And that person being drowned was Brian Jones. So he witnessed Brian Jones being murdered, and he was scared to talk about it for years until he finally came out with a memoir about it, according to Hotchner. And so that's just an example of how Jones and Jagger were the most anti-war, most vocal about it, and one was killed. So obviously Jagger was scared off from further work, and I also show evidence that there was attempts on Jagger's life after that by people that had been contracted by the FBI and CIA before.
Yeah, but isn't it easy to say? I mean, most celebrities have been targeted at one time or another with death threats and just kooky people that want to take their lives. I mean, it's part and part and parcel for the exposure. Even radio show hosts get nasty letters and threats.
But not directly by U.S. intelligence or British intelligence agents. This was an FBI undercover agent named Jove / alias Schneiderman, who was uncovered by the London Daily newspaper, saying this is an undercover FBI agent, and this was the first person to give Jagger, his first hit of acid. And so, you can't say that all these celebrities get death threats from were actually targeted by these U.S. intelligence agents. So that's where it gets different.
And with that being a truth, then why is that not a bigger part of our culture? Why is that not being exposed more? I mean, if it's out there and you were able to find it, it seems like it should be something that would be reported by the major media sources, because that's dirty, sexy laundry. People want to know that stuff.
Right. That's another good question, Dave. Thanks. Because I show in the first 2 chapters of my book the way that the media has slowly been controlled by the wealthiest families, the wealthiest corporations, and the CIA. I quote Ben Bagdickian, who was former dean of the Berkeley School of Journalism, who showed how it's come down to about 6 top multinational corporations that own about 95% of our media. And Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame, Watergate muckraker, came out with an article in 1977 where he just covered what the Senate Church Committee found in 1976, which said that well over 400 members of the media lived dual lives and they worked for the CIA. And he listed them, and they were the owners of included the ownership of all the major media. And they were living dual lives and they worked for the CIA. And it shows that that's how they control mainstream media, to keep this kind of information out of our media. So even though it's sexy and people would want to find out about it, it's censored. It's censored from most of our media. And London, the British media is a little less censored, so they can come out with more of this stuff. But in our country, it's much more censored.
Right, but in Europe and in England, a lot of their quote-unquote reliable news sources are, what we would consider the National Enquirer here in the United States, the Sun and Weekly World News. It's a lot of, tripe that's being trolled out as fact, and that's been a big part of the news for years. Or are you asserting that that's just the way that our media handles that, so when these stories break, they undermine the validity of those stories?
Yeah, I argue they undermine the validity of them because of the fact these are daily British newspapers. These aren't the like World Weekly News kind of crap magazines I'm talking about. I'm talking about the more reliable sources that are more in line with Reuters, which is of course a British version of the Associated Press. These are some of the places that have this information and come out with more information, and our American media just doesn't, squashes this kind of information before it gets to print.
Have you had any threats personally getting involved in this and doing this type of research and uncovering these facts?
Not direct threats. I've had my mail opened up. People will say that when I sent them things, it just they got the package without the contents of the package, and things like that. I've had strange things happen with past interviews where all of a sudden my phone didn't work. Just different things like that come up and happen.
All right, I think we're coming up pretty close to a break here, so I don't want to get into too in depth. But you're saying that the CIA uses drugs to kind of target these activists. Mm-hmm. The families, the wealthy families, pick these people out. Is it because of their activism, because of how vocal they are? I mean, the drug culture is big in the music industry anyway. Even people that are not in high levels are have easy access. I've got friends that are musicians around the United States, and it's at every level. Yeah,
and what I argue in this book is that it's not just natural. It's not like natural for all these musicians to naturally use drugs. It's actually pushed and cultivated. The whole industry has cultivated this drug culture in order to use it as a vehicle for popularizing the drugs more amongst the masses, to keep them from being as competent at fighting some of the things that the top wants to keep happening. Because youth was getting so active in the 60s around civil rights, around anti-war, actions, and so they cultivated all this drugs being naturally associated with rock and roll. It's the sex, drugs, and rock and roll idea. And I show the evidence of how that occurred, how they kept pushing all these drugs on the musicians, and it isn't just natural that people that make music just want to keep using drugs all the time.
John Potash, my guest. We have to take a break. We'll come back, talk more about his book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. We'll do that. I'm your host, Dave Schrader, and this is Coast to Coast AM. I've had a great time hosting last night and tonight. I'll be back again on August 1st. And if you've missed any of the other episodes I've hosted, or you've missed any part of tonight's show and you'd like to catch up, it's very easy to do. You can become a Coast Insider for a yearly membership. It breaks down to literally 15 cents a day. It'll give you over 5 years of past archives. You can hear all the shows I've hosted, George Knapp, George Norrie, all of the great hosts that fill in on Coast to Coast AM. And you'll be able to get access to the news, the newsletters, live chats with George Norrie and the hosts, and some of the best guests in the world. Literally 15 cents a day. Where are you going to get that kind of entertainment? You can take it along with you. There's apps. There's all this fun stuff. Go check out coasttocoastam.com. And while you're there, click on the Insider tab to get all the information and find out how you can sign up and never miss another minute of the best in overnight talk radio. You'll also find some great information about George's TV series. It's right there on the site. You can see the trailer and become part of Beyond Belief. That's all available. And don't forget George's brand new endeavor, for those of you that are looking for that special someone that you can get underneath the covers with and listen to Coast Radio, talk about and discuss conspiracy theories, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, and other creepy subjects, or if you're just looking for a new friend that has the same kind of interest, check out paranormaldate.com. That's paranormaldate.com. It's free to join, and if you decide you'd like to stay on and become a full-on member, use the coupon code George to get some deep savings, and you'll be able to become a full-time member of Paranormal Date. Now over 11,000 members around the United States. Other like-minded individuals just like you that are seeking friendship and love with somebody with the same type of interests. That's all taking place at coasttocoastam.com. Go check that out and become an insider today. We'll be back with our guest, John Potash, with more of drugs as weapons against us right here on Coast to Coast AM. We will be opening up phone lines a little bit later on in the show. In the last hour, if you have questions, thoughts, or you'd like to weigh in on the topic this evening with our guest, John Potash. John, talk to me. You state that in the book, the CIA's MK Ultra program worked with Timothy Leary and in San Francisco. How did that whole thing play out?
Well, MK Ultra was funding something called the Human Ecology Fund, and so the Human Ecology Fund was out of Cornell Medical School, and they got, it turned out it was somewhat of a CIA front organization, so they gave grants to over 100 colleges around the country, and a lot of the people, most of the people, like great majority of these professors didn't know that their money was actually coming from the CIA. They just thought it was coming from this fund. And they were getting funds to test psychedelics on volunteers at the schools, and so they would give students a lot of money, basically, but I guess it was about $150 they would get for being tested with these psychedelics. Now, Timothy Leary was just using mushrooms at the time, and psychedelic mushrooms, and I don't get into whether psychedelic mushrooms cause any kind of permanent damage or not, because I just didn't find information on that, but so then a guy named Michael Hollingshead, who called himself a British propaganda agent, I show a lot of evidence that he was working for British CIA, but so because they were doing similar things in Britain as they were doing in the United States with MK Ultra. But so Michael Hollingshead is living right near the United Nations and inviting dignitaries over from the United Nations, where they would come to his parties and he'd spread acid all over his furniture, so that when they touched anything, they would actually get a hit of acid. And this was in line with MK Ultra's having ABC News came out with the fact that the CIA MK Ultra had a psychedelic hit list where they would target leftist leaders around the world, including Egypt's Nasser, Cuba's Castro and Che Guevara, with acid to make them seem less competent and argue hurt their competency in the long term. But so here was Hollingshead doing the same thing near the United Nations. He then takes a jar of acid, which he gets, 10,000 hits he has, which he gets when it was supposed to be illegal for anyone to be able to obtain large quantities of acid. He takes that acid, goes to visit Leary, and convinces Leary to trip for the first time with LSD, because Leary had never tried LSD by that point. He was just using the psychedelic mushrooms, and convinces him to trip, has Leary tripping for 3 straight days on just one hit. I mean, he gives him a ton of, super hit of acid that has him tripping for 3 straight days. You're really only supposed to trip for 8 hours when you take a hit of acid. And so he turns his mind into a kind of a mess for a while, and Leary becomes his lapdog for a while, according to the fellow professors who were friends with Leary. From that point on, he kind of directed Leary, and Leary started testing acid on the students instead of the psychedelic mushrooms. But Leary ends up admitting in interviews that he actually ended up finding out that he was working for the CIA, and he was okay with it. And he kept doing it. He kept doing what they wanted him to do. And so he ends up starting. He gets kicked out of Harvard, starts this group, and is funded by a group called the family, the Mellon Hitchcocks, Peggy and William Mellon Hitchcock. Now they are some of the wealthiest people in the world. They own Mellon Bank. They own Gulf Oil. They're intimately linked with U.S. intelligence. They held different high-level U.S. intelligence posts at different times. And so Billy Mellon Hitchcock gives him his estate, his mansion and his estate to have constant parties at. So they keep inviting New Yorkers up to these parties in this Millbrook estate in the mid-'60s. And there's MK Ultra scientists at the parties just hanging out there for a year or more, testing different psychedelics on the people that come to this mansion. And so that's what they were doing with him. And then they gave him a huge spotlight in the media all the time to say, turn on, tune in, drop out. And it's obviously what he wants them to drop out of the activism that's budding amongst all youth with civil rights activism, Freedom Summer, supporting MLK and the Freedom Summer movement, and the anti-war, activism that's becoming more and more popular in the mid-'60s. So that's how I argue.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Let me reel back one thing. Now, you said that they were coating furniture with the LSD?
That was Hollingshead. Yeah, this British agent was doing that at his apartment right near the United Nations when he was inviting United Nations diplomats over. So I argue he was doing the same thing as that MK Ultra psychedelic hit list. He was targeting certain UN dignitaries.
Well, help me out. Now, you said you've taken acid yourself.
Yeah, I have, yeah.
I'll tell you, I had an opportunity once, I'm sure I had it multiple times, but really only once that I was directly offered acid. And I was at school, one of my buddies had this little piece of paper, this little square, and he was talking to me about how great acid is, and here, go ahead, you got to try this. So I said, all right, and I just grabbed the whole sheet and went to throw it in my mouth, and he's like, whoa! He said, don't do that, man, you got to tear that into fourths. And I saw this little square piece of paper. Mm-hmm. And I said, why do I have to tear it in fourths? He goes, that whole thing will kill you. And I sat back and I said, you mean that this little piece of paper, this little square of paper that I'm going to pop in my mouth, if I don't tear it in fourths, it's going to do some severe damage, could kill me? He said, oh, yeah. So I gave it back. I said, no, thanks. I have no interest in doing something that this piece of paper, this small, could hurt me that badly. If you're coating furniture and people are touching it and absorbing it through the skin, that would seem like massive amounts of overdose levels.
Yeah. I mean, it's not clear that it ever kills anyone, but it does do some damage, yes. Yeah, it's bad news. And that's what a lot of these guys were doing. They were giving super doses to people, and it's spelled out. Martin Lee, founder of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, wrote a great book called Acid Dreams about the history of acid and the CIA, covering a lot of the information that I cover, but I go a lot further than him. But he did a good job of showing how they were, all these people connected to U.S. intelligence were giving these super doses this way to a number of different leftists around the country. And so, yeah, that's what was happening.
Wow. All right. So continue on with this, because this
Sure.
fascinates me. So there, Timothy Leary, the whole tune in, tune out, drop out, all that, that was the reason he was getting so much press and was so vocal, and it was because the government was allowing this, because they wanted to get people into this culture where they could control them more easily. Control them
more easily and divert them from the activism that was getting just so much more popular, at that time in the 60s. And the thing is, people don't realize that you can't just, to do good activism, as being a community organizer at one time myself, it takes a lot of time, and it takes really sharp thinking to come up with tactics when you're working against powerful forces like the people that want the Vietnam War, the people that want to continue segregation. They're very powerful, and you have to come up with, devise all kinds of good tactics, and it was hurting their ability to do that. And so, That's, and so it was also diverting them from, when he says drop out, it's drop out of general society, as if you drop out of it and don't pay attention to the war, it'll go away, which, isn't the case. You gotta protest the war to try to stop it, and eventually enough people were protesting the Vietnam War that did eventually stop, and they show that, I document how they even said that these final tactics and all these people doing these final things caused Nixon to not have enough troops at home, that he was fearful of takeover of the government, takeover of the White House, because people were so upset about their friends, family, and themselves being in danger of dying in the Vietnam War. So, but what you had Leary doing this on the East Coast. On the West Coast, you had the growing acid test movement. You might have heard of the acid test with the King Kesey and the pranksters. And so he holds these acid tests that have the Grateful Dead playing at them. They're called the Warlocks then, and they get bigger and bigger. They go from several dozen people to 100 people to hundreds to 1,000 people to thousands of people at these acid tests. And a high-level MKUltra scientist named John Gittinger said in a legal deposition that me and two other scientists were at several of these early acid tests. So what is he doing, flying from Washington to San Francisco to be at these acid tests? I showed that and other evidence to show that this is actually MKUltra organized, MKUltra involved. And it was the same thing that they're doing with Leary on the East Coast, they're doing with these acid tests on the West Coast. And so they were kind of just promoting it. In the marketing world, they have something called AstroTurf organizing, or AstroTurf campaigns. What that means is it's fake grassroots organizing. That's a known strategy amongst marketing executives. And so this was one huge AstroTurf campaign. They pretend like it's underground to make it more appealing, but obviously the media is giving it so much attention that it's not just underground. Powerful people are making it look like it's underground to make it more appealing. So the acid test grew into be-ins that became 10,000 or more people at these areas, and MKUltra scientists were there testing different psychedelics at these events, according to Martin Lee, and he researched, he went over thousands of MKUltra documents to show this. And then they turned into, became the Trips Festival, then the Be-Ins, and then it shows that some of these same individuals connected to U.S. intelligence were involved in organizing the first music fest, sadly enough. These music fests, like the Monterey Pop Festival, was a great festival for music, but it was also testing tons of psychedelics on kids and drawing so many young people to the San Francisco area at a time that Lee interviewed some, MKUltra agents who said, well, we were helping run underground, supposedly underground acid laboratories in the San Francisco area. And they said they wouldn't reveal why they were doing that, but they were part of it, yeah.
It seems like if they really wanted the country hooked on this and make them more malleable and easy to control, why weren't they just tainting the water supply? I mean, they're hitting it with fluorides and other
that's too blatant
fillers.
I mean, if everyone's all of a sudden tripping, that's a hysteria. That's something too blatant. It had to be done in a way that isn't so outright that people know what's going on. Why are they making us all trip all of a sudden? Yeah.
Right, but you're only getting a part of the action that you would have gotten anyway. If you're trying to get mom and pop and the decision makers and the voters and the people involved, it just seems to me like they're missing a huge aspect of their focus group with what they're trying to control.
Yeah, well, they're trying to get the youth in general. Like, for example, when they were targeting spots where there was the most leftist activism, most anti-war activism, Berkeley was the epicenter of anti-war, of leftist activism at that time. And people said they got into the Berkeley free speech movement at the same time as they got into the hippie movement. And so they were targeting Berkeley students. New York was the biggest area of recruiters for the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the New York area. And so that's why I argue that happened right above New York City, and the other area epicenter happened right in San Francisco near the Berkeley campus. And San Francisco was always a leftist haven of protests. So they were targeting certain places, but they ended up targeting lots of different cities in the same way. They end up, the things I described that happened in San Francisco that turned a lot of San Francisco into a kind of psychedelic wasteland, particularly Haight-Ashbury. I can show evidence that was happening in New York's Lower East Side, and a number of cities had the same kind of thing happening. It's happening in Austin, Texas, and a number of different places. So it was being replicated around the country.
All right, you mentioned SDS. What does that stand for, and why would the CIA murderously target them?
Yeah, that was the Students for Democratic Society. And, our history books do not cover them, but they were the largest anti-war movement in the country, probably ever, but at least, at that time, it was the largest anti-war movement, and, against the Vietnam War. And they were also very into civil rights, and they were getting bigger and bigger, and to the point that they were over 100,000 membership of students around the country. They led the biggest building takeovers on college campuses around the country against the Vietnam War. And so the way they were targeted, I give one good example. They were targeted at Columbia University, SDS, in New York City, because at Columbia there was a very charismatic, bright leader named Mark Rudd, who was doing great work, great organizing against racism, but particularly against the Vietnam War. So in 1968, he led him and his Action Faction part of SDS led the first building takeover, where they took over 4 or 5 major buildings on Columbia campus. That kind of role modeled that kind of action for the rest of the country, where there started to be building takeovers all over the country by Students for Democratic Society chapters. And Columbia SDS said, we are against the use of LSD. We think it's anti-revolutionary. And, the word revolution was being thrown around then, but it was really just about changing society to stop the war. And so I show the evidence that a group called the Crazies, which was an offshoot group of Abbie Hoffman's Yippie group, was started by a guy named George Demerly, who came out in trial as an undercover FBI agent. And the Crazies went and dosed the punch of the Columbia SDS party and got them all tripping for the first time after they said they were rabidly against acid. But once they started tripping, they didn't think it was so bad. They ended up saying, well, we give up on our anti-acid stance because it seemed to be fun. So they kept tripping, and then I show Mark Rudd's behavior became highly erratic after that. He became highly disrespected for doing some crazy stuff, lauding the fact that he hadn't read a book in a year, starting fights with other activists on the stages of conferences to show that he's a tougher, more serious activist than them. And then when him and Bernadine Dorn, who was also an excellent national SDS leader, she was a lawyer who got convinced to start tripping. When they kind of led the group when the group splintered off and became defunct. But they also started a group called the Weathermen, you might have heard of. It became the Weather Underground. But the Weathermen, when they had their first conference, Bernadine Dorn was so messed up in her mind, if I show from the acid, that she lauded the Manson family, saying it's the year of the fork in honor of the Manson murderer that stuck a fork in pregnant Sharon Tate's belly as part of their murder of her. So they really were losing their minds on the acid at that point. And once they sobered up, I showed that they got a little more serious and a little more clear-minded about things. But it takes a while to sober up completely and to get away from the effects of the acid.
All right, we've got a lot more to cover this evening, and including we'll be talking about why would the CIA have any interest in targeting Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Tupac. We've talked a little bit about the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, considered 2 of the top bands of the 60s. How and why would the U.S. and British intelligence target them? And we'll talk about the Panthers in the 60s and so on. That's what's coming up this evening as we continue our journey on Coast to Coast AM. Again, we have links up for our guest, John Potash, and his book. The book, again, is entitled Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. That continues on Coast to Coast AM. Well, thank you very much for tuning in and staying with me late into the evening or early into the morning, depending on where you are. I'm Dave Schrader. You can hear my show, Darkness Radio, Monday through Friday, 9 p.m. till midnight. We talk about all aspects of the strange and supernatural. You can check it out at darknessradio.com. We have a live stream right from our home studio at Twin Cities News Talk, AM 1130. And then keep your dial right there, because as soon as we're done, you can tune in to George Norrie and Coast to Coast to continue into the fringe and strange world around us. We've got a great guest lined up this evening, John Potash. He's talking about his book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. We're going to find out why would the CIA target people like Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, Kurt Cobain, even Tupac? What is behind this? We're just starting to scratch the surface. Stay with us as we continue to talk to John Potash. And then at the top of next hour, we're going to open up phone lines. So if you have questions for our guest, it's your turn to chime in. We'll do that next on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. I'm your host this evening, Dave Schrader. John Potash, my guest. John, why would the CIA have any interest in targeting Kurt Cobain?
Yeah, do you mind, Dave, if I just backtrack a little bit, just because your ads kept talking about the Kennedys, and I have a chapter on the Kennedys. So I just want to address that and then get into the musicians a little bit more.
Go for it.
Yeah, because you obviously had people talk about the Kennedy assassination on your show before, and I agree with what I heard on the excerpts, because the Kennedys, both John and Robert, when they were, John was president and Robert was Attorney General, they closed down. They fired CIA Director Alan Dulles, who had formerly been a lawyer for the Rockefellers, who were massively behind MKUltra. And Dulles was, of course, a big proponent of MKUltra. They fired Dulles. They canned MKUltra. They closed it down. But the deputy director of the CIA, Richard Helms, kept running it behind the new CIA director's back. And because of that, because the Kennedys tried to clamp down on the mafia that were trafficking cocaine, such as the Marcello family trafficking cocaine out of New Orleans, and the Genovese family that were the New York opium traffickers that were working with the CIA while they were trafficking opium. Those were some of the reasons that they targeted JFK and RFK. CIA's, the CIA operations, I argue, and I show the evidence of that. And they use other means. They use means of which I go into details in my book. But I'll get back now. I just want to talk about the musicians too, which you asked about. Why Cobain? Well, I interviewed a CIA station chief named John Stockwell. When I say interview, I just talked to him after a conference in Baltimore in 1990, and he told me that he personally was flying opium out of the Vietnam area into the United States, and he knew of all that it was just part of Air America's work in trafficking opium from that they call it the Golden Triangle area for producing opium, because it's the best poppy fields in the world are at one end of a mountain range. And he said at the other end of the same mountain range is the Golden Crescent of opium, which is in Afghanistan. And I show that it's not a coincidence that those were the areas of our two longest wars in American history. So at that time, that was 1990, he said that after the kind of Golden Triangle died down, we lost, basically lost the Vietnam War. We didn't have as much control over the region. We couldn't get as much, heroin from that area that was coming into the United States. We then developed assets around Afghanistan, the Golden Crescent area of opium fields and poppy fields for producing opium, and that became the new biggest area of opium shipping. And it grew hugely in the 1980s up until about into the 1990s too, where we had so much supply of opium coming into our country, but we didn't have the demand that they wanted. So to make demand match supply, they had to get more people using opium. And who do they get? They get the role models. The same thing that they were trying to do in the 60s with getting the role models to use acid and promote that and promote other drugs. Of course, a lot of them turned to heroin too, like John Lennon, as you've heard in one of his songs before. So I show that what they do is they psychologically assess a number of different musicians that might have a susceptibility to being, if they're introduced to more and more, heroin, could they develop a habit? Could they be inadvertently promoting heroin? And because Kurt Cobain had a chronic intestinal ailment and had dabbled in it, tried it he said in his diaries, about 6 times in 4 years he tried heroin because he went to so many doctors, he said in interviews, that just couldn't relieve his chronic ailment, that heroin was the only thing that worked for him to relieve his intense pain. And so I showed the evidence that agents got him using it daily, and it's very controversial, but Courtney Love's life actually shows her work with the CIA from way back when. And 16 years old, her biological father, I talked to for hours, said she was traveling with a CIA agent at 16 years old, which was already, or 17 years old, I'm sorry, but she had just turned 17. She was already a heroin addict and prostitute at that age. And even her memoirs, she admits she had gotten into prostitution. There's eyewitnesses that can attest to. I mean, her biological father said she was leaving needles all over his basement because he had lost custody over her for about 10 years, and she got into heroin addiction when he had lost custody and couldn't see her for a long time. And then when he went to try to get her again, when she appealed to him to get her out of juvenile detention, she was a mess, and he had a monster on his hands. She had already had all kinds of problems and addictions, and which was just very messed up, and so she was, I argue that she was manipulated by the CIA. She was traveling with them throughout England, passing out. She had brought 1,000 hits of acid over to England with the CIA agent traveling with her, spread it out to musicians and bands, the top bands in the Liverpool area, and did the same, spreading drugs in Portland, spreading drugs in L.A., all as a teenager, believe it or not, while she was also prostituting. And her first husband said she was prostituting to Army generals in Alaska, and they told her that the wars were good for us, and she turned out to be very right-wing in her politics. And her biological father said he knew that she actually had prostituted with David Packard, believe it or not, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was also famous from being Hewlett-Packard fame, So, believe it or not, so a lot of people in Seattle say Kurt Cobain only started using heroin daily when she entered his life and got him using daily. And then when he finally found a cure to his stomach ailment a year before his death, he actually got clean and sober. And when he had that coma in Rome, the doctors attested to the fact that there was no illegal substances in his body except these Rohypnol that was Courtney Love's prescription. And Rohypnol is roofies, the date rape drug, so you lose your memory of what happened when you're dosed with them.
Well, what was she using that for? Who would give a prescription for Rohypnol? What is the malady you're dealing with?
In England, it's prescribed for sleep problems, and it's allowed to be a prescription in England for sleep problems. And so she was in England at the time while he was doing a tour in Europe, and they were, according to tape recordings of their lawyer, Rosemary Carroll, that Private Detective Tom Grant had and are played in the movie Soaked in Bleach that just came out recently. She was, Kurt Cobain was already divorcing Love. He already said, to cut her out of his will. They already had a prenuptial agreement when they were married, so she was not going to get any of his money. But so she and Rosemary Carroll in the tape said that she asked her to get the most vicious, divorce lawyer possible, and it's just, there's like loads of evidence in that Soaked in Bleach that they were, on the outs, and she was going to be cut off from all that money. Now that's just a greed motive, but when it comes to there was a load of police foul play that Tom Grant shows, and he's a former Los Angeles police officer turned private detective who she actually hired to supposedly look for Cobain just a few days before he was found dead. But Grant ended up finding all this evidence that she was involved in helping orchestrate his death, such as Cobain's credit card that was on him at the time of his death was found to be used after his death. They took photographs of the scene, but didn't actually develop the photographs of the murder scene or the death scene of Cobain for 20 years, and they didn't have any good reason why. They just developed them about within the last year or two, and they came out in the press. And so there's a load of evidence.
I thought there's been photographs circulating for quite a while of the death scene.
No, they didn't. Well, not from the police, because the police didn't develop them. And this came out in many newspaper articles within the past year because they just said, oh, for the first time, the police, the Seattle police have developed the photographs, and here they are, and here's all these photographs. So, yeah, they actually didn't develop them. And experts say that these photographs are very important, these police photographs, because they show whether, it would leave a fingerprint when the blood splatter hits his hand on the gun. It would show whether it was just his finger, his handprint on the gun, or if someone else might have been holding the gun. Was there an extra handprint and things like that. There's a number of different reasons the photographs are very important. And Cyril Wecht, the president of the American Forensics Association, is a top expert on CNN many times. You might have seen him recently. But he says in this film, it was unbelievable that they came out with the verdict of suicide the same day as they found Cobain's body. He says that's unheard of. You can't do that. You have to do an autopsy. You have to do so many other things before you can come out with a verdict. And so some police officers
even when they have a letter, they've seen the site. There's the weapon there. He's there. I mean,
yes.
Then they still would need to go deeper into that.
Yes, because the letter had a change in handwriting at a key part of the letter. The letter was actually sounding all like a goodbye to fans because Nirvana was ending, and which was the truth. Both other band members said, yes, Cobain called, Kurt called us and said he's ending the band. But the last part of the letter, the only part that actually looks like a suicide note, has a different handwriting, according to handwriting experts. And so that's a major issue right there. There's a 3 times the level of opiates in his system that would kill even a severe addict.
Well, then let's look at that then. Okay, so you've got perhaps he took the opiates before he started writing the letter. So he as he starts, his handwriting is going to appear one way. As he becomes more sloppy, more high, whatever, his handwriting would take a turn, especially if it starts going from, maybe what was this goodbye to the fans, and then the darkness of life and what was going on in his life starts to seep into it. Then
Dave,
your handwriting would change as well, right? I mean, I've written notes when I've had a couple too many beers, and my handwriting at the beginning of the note never looks like the same handwriting at the end of the note, and that's just on a couple of drinks.
Dave, Cyril Wecht explained it, that that level of opiates in his system would have killed him in seconds, not minutes, seconds. Seconds after you shoot up that level of opium, that level of heroin, addicts are found dead from overdosing with the needle still stuck in their arm. That's how quickly that can kill you. He says he can't even imagine that he really could have picked up the shotgun to kill himself after shooting up that much. He said he would have to have the shotgun already in his hand to possibly pull it off. And he said even then it's dubious whether he could have actually killed himself. So forget about writing a whole letter after you shoot up that much. It kills you in seconds. That's the way mainlining heroin works. But the other aspect of it is, there's so many aspects of it. He actually put his tools away. Not he, but somebody put his tools away after he shot up the amount of heroin that should have killed him instantly. But
well, a lot of the musicians that you're looking here also fit into this other thing called the 27 Club.
Right.
And you've got so many of these singers, Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, that all died at the exact same age. Is there some kind of punch to that the CIA used as well, or is that just wow, what a weird coincidence kind of situation?
I can't say for sure about that, except for the fact that sometimes I've shown in other political murders, political assassinations with the U.S. intelligence, they do use psychological techniques such as what I call a threat timing tactic or an anniversary timing tactic. The best writer and researcher on Martin Luther King's assassination was a guy named William Pepper. He was a lawyer and friend of Martin Luther King's before he died. He ended up becoming an Oxford professor. He teaches human rights courses at Oxford University now. He came out. He studied MLK's assassination for over 20 years and came out with 2 books. One, Orders to Kill, and the other, Active State. In Active State, he just covers the famous trial where he represented the King family in a court case in 1999, where the King family said that the government were co-conspirators in MLK's assassination, and this man William Pepper represented them. And the jury found that that they were guilty, that the government were guilty of co-conspiring to kill MLK. But, of course, the media ignored that famous case, and sadly enough, and misrepresented it. But Pepper says that MLK was killed in exactly 1 year after he came out against the Vietnam War, and that it was no coincidence that he was killed exactly 1 year, the anniversary date of his coming out publicly against the Vietnam War. And I show how there was other political assassinations with that same anniversary timing tactic. So that 27 date could be that, though I'm not sure. My guess is it's at least the fact that around your later 20s, you tend to become more of an independent thinker, more mature, and a lot of these guys like Hendricks and Cobain, were sobering up before they died. They were getting more into activism before they died. And Janis Joplin was the same thing. She was trying to kick heroin. She was first introduced to speed by a guy who admitted he was an FBI agent. That guy became her fiancé until she found out he had a whole other family in another state. So she got away from him, but she was just about to hold two stadium concerts to support the anti-war protests, and she announced them on the Dick Cavett show, and she got an overly pure dose of heroin that killed her just before these concerts. And when she was trying to kick, she had a relapse. But so this is the pattern that you see. And with Hendricks, an MI6 agent inserted himself as his manager because that's British CIA. Because Hendricks couldn't make it big in the United States at first. He first made it big in England, and he couldn't handle all the huge tour and concert events that were needed for his sudden rise to fame. And here's this guy with all these connections and all this power, Mike Jeffries, and Mike Jeffrey ends up kind of controlling Hendricks' life. And Hendricks tries to get away from him, and he can't fire him. Jeffrey does crazy things like Hendricks thinks that he got Mafia to kidnap him for 3 days because Hendricks was actually kidnapped by Mafia for 3 days, and Jeffrey said he got bigger Mafia to free him. Hendricks said that he thought that Jeffrey planted drugs on him at an airport to get him under legal authority's thumb because he would never do that. He would never bring drugs to an airport. And then Hendricks said that he also sabotaged when he tried to do anti-war benefits. First he wouldn't allow him to do them, and then when Hendricks did them anyway, he thinks that Jeffrey dosed his drink with a super psychedelic that messed up his guitar playing, and he had to end the benefit early. So then within 48 hours of him firing Mike Jeffrey, he's killed. Hendricks dies. And so a roadie just came out with a memoir within the last few years, a roadie for Hendricks, a guy named James Tapper, and in that memoir he says that Mike Jeffrey actually admitted to him that he had Hendricks killed.
Really?
Yeah. Comes
straight out and admits it. No.
He actually admitted. Yeah. He then called himself and said, "Well, here's why: because I was going to lose so much money and things like that. But how do you just have someone killed within 48 hours of them firing you? Who can do that? So it's obvious someone with intelligence connections can do that."
All right, we've got a lot more to cover throughout the show. We've got links up on the website. If you go to coasttocoastam.com, you can find more information on our guest, John Potash, JOHNPOTASH.com. That's the website to visit, and you get more information about our guest, more information about his books. And if you've missed any part of tonight's show and you'd like to catch up, know where you can find that, well, it's real simple. Go to coasttocoastam.com. Become an insider, and that'll give you access to 5 years of past archives of the show. That means you'll never miss another minute of the best in overnight talk radio. You'll be able to hear all of the great guests. You'll be able to access the news source on the site. You'll be able to access all of the great interviews, all of the great live chats with George Norrie and the other hosts of Coast to Coast, and some of the best guests from around the world. They're all on one place. You can just go check it out at coasttocoastam.com. Become a member now at the Coast Insiders Club. And for 15 cents a day, you get all that, and you find out more about George Norrie's TV show Beyond Belief and his new program, his new endeavor, which is paranormaldate.com. So for those of you looking to find someone special that has an equal interest in the strange and supernatural, there's finally a site for you. You are not alone at paranormaldate.com. Go check that out. We'll be back with more Coast to Coast AM right after this. Well, this is Coast to Coast AM. I'm not George Knapp. George will be with you tomorrow night. I'm Dave Schrader. I'll be your host for the evening. And we're going to open up phone lines at the top of the next hour. If you have questions or thoughts, your own input on the topic we're talking about tonight, drugs as weapons against us. John Potash, our guest. Hey, if you've got time, go stop by the Coast to Coast AM website. Check out our news stories. 2 feature stories. An ugly champion has been crowned. A mixed breed dog dubbed Quasimodo bested a field of 27 repugnant competitors on Friday to claim the title of the world's ugliest dog for 2015. And this thing looks like it's something straight out of a Pixar movie. Then we've got the hot story tonight. Near-death experiences change the brain. A study of plane crash survivors show permanent imprints of the event in their brains. That's all right on the site. If you go check it out at coasttocoastam.com. There's other great and fascinating news stories posted there every day, so make sure that you stop by and keep up with all of the strange and unusual news that pops up every day. We're going to take another break. We'll be back with John Potash right here on Coast to Coast AM. It has just been brought to my attention that one of the former guests of Coast to Coast AM has recently passed. Red Elk, who had some famous interviews on Coast to Coast with Art Bell over the years, has been in poor health and finally passed away. Our thoughts are out with his family. All right, we are back. John Potash, our guest, drugs as weapons against us. Talk to me a little bit more about, you've got the Jimi Hendrix. I understand kind of the 60s counterculture and rebellion against the war and things like that. Why Tupac? His involvement in this, I didn't even really, I guess I wasn't aware he was a political activist to begin with.
Yeah. Well, he's an interesting case because of the fact that his family were the leading New York Black Panthers. Afeni Shakur's mother was a one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers, and the Shakurs were connected to Malcolm X. Saeedine Abba Shakur was a close confidant of Malcolm X's. He had his sons Lumumba and Zaid Shakur and his adopted son Matulu Shakur join Malcolm X's group before Malcolm X died. And so they were like leading New York activists, and Lumumba started the Harlem Black Panthers before he married Afeni Shakur. Zaid helped found the Bronx Black Panthers. Matulu Shakur started a group called the Republic of New Africa. That was a national group that met in Detroit and was part of grassroots organizers all meeting in Detroit at Aretha Franklin's father's church, it just so happened. And so they were all top organizers, top activists in the 60s. And so Afeni ended up having Tupac Shakur in 1971 after she actually defended herself in court on a frame-up of the leading New York Panthers, the famous New York Black Panther 21 case. And so she was a brilliant woman who played her own lawyer in court and was credited with getting all the Black Panther leaders off in court. Then she gives birth to Tupac a month after getting off in court. And Tupac, she calls her Black Prince of the Revolution. So Tupac was groomed for activist leadership from birth, literally. And so he went to activist meetings as a kid. And then Lumumba and Afeni ended up divorcing. Afeni ended up, because it's a long story why, but she ends up moving in with his adopted brother Matulu, and they become a partnership. And Matulu's assistant director of Lincoln Detox in the Bronx, which was an incredibly innovative drug treatment center using acupuncture for drug treatment, and I actually got trained there for drug treatment myself. And so he was doing great work there, and the city just closed the place down. And strangely enough, their director and their lawyer were found dead with drugs strangely inserted in their bodies. It's crazy stuff. But Matulu's targeted, and so the FBI started visiting Tupac while he's in school, asking, "Do you know where your fugitive stepfather is?" And so Tupac got involved with a group called the New African People's Organization that was started by former Black Panthers and former Republic of New Africa activists. And by the age of 17, he was elected chairman of their young adult group called the New African Panthers, which were about the same ages as the Black Panthers when they started, and they were attempting to replicate the Black Panthers. And they were active in 8 cities. And so Tupac was already an activist leader before he became a rapper. So it was only natural that the FBI continued to watch him very closely, like they were watching his family. And I showed the evidence that they actually used undercover agents to help get Fanny addicted to crack, his mother addicted to crack, which kind of took her out of her activism for a number of years. And they also did the same thing with the Black Panther national founder, Huey Newton. I showed the evidence of that. So here's Tupac, head of this group, and then he goes and gets an offer to tour with Digital Underground. So he decides he only leaves his activist leadership in order to use a different modality to to further his activism and start getting more into the art. And at that point, though, he made plans with his extended Black Panther family to take on this gangsta persona, to pretend to be a gangsta in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. It was part of what the his Black Panther extended family was doing in the Los Angeles area when in 1972 they got the Bloods and the Crips, those notoriously warring gangs, to stop fighting each other and to fight racism and turn on to activism. And that peace truce between the Bloods and the Crips started spreading throughout L.A., then throughout California, and then started spreading nationwide. And Tupac, by getting this, gangster persona, was trying to appeal to gangs and get them, listening to him, and then, getting these peace truces going. He would go to peace truce picnics and introduce the Blood and Crip leaders to each other to get them to stop warring with each other. And he was having a serious effect at stopping all of this drug dealing by getting these gangs to convert to activism and stop dealing drugs. And so he became a major threat for that reason. And so I show that there was actually 4 attempts on his life, 2 at the hands of police and others with police foul play involved before he was actually shot and killed in Las Vegas. And I show how a high-level police detective who was investigating death row records found dozens of his fellow police officers at all levels of death row records. And when he asked his superiors what they're doing there, his superiors thought just because he's white, he's not going to be a whistleblower. So they said you can call them troubleshooters or covert agents. And so these police officers, witnesses argue and show, help set up, orchestrate his murder.
Yeah, boy, and here I just thought it was an East Coast, West Coast thing, huh?
Yeah, that's what they, Russell Poole says they use this, East Coast, West Coast thing, this Biggie versus Tupac thing to hide what was really going on, that they were setting up his murder. But they also, death row records, besides doing that, they were also trafficking drugs and trafficking guns and trying to end the Bloods versus Crips peace truces.
Well, since you were talking about the Panthers, do you think the targeting of the Panthers in the 60s and other black figures, has that anything to do with the police brutality incidents in the news now?
I do think it does, sadly enough, because I just think it's different tactics to oppress the black community and stop activism and put fear into the black community, to not do it, to not rise up to try to change things for the better for themselves.
All right, and we're coming up to the top of the hour. We'll be opening up phone lines for listeners that would like to call in and talk with you about this. Now, talk to me. I mean, I know Elvis was involved in a lot of different things, and, he seemed to have a lot of strange agendas. He, fancied himself quite the, super patriot and right. Actually tried to work with police officers and law enforcement agencies to stop drugs. Meanwhile, he's one of the unfortunate big drug addicts himself. Mm-hmm. People don't usually think of Elvis really as political, right. So much as just a media kind of media mogul. Why do you think he would have been targeted for something like this?
few reasons I'm going to tell you about. One is when he rose to fame at 21 years old, he was the biggest sensation in the whole country. Okay, and this was mid 1950s. And first of all, he loved black music, and he was called the king of rock and roll, even probably in the 50s. But he kept saying no. Bo Diddley and all these great black, and B.B. King, all these great black entertainers, they're the kings of rock and roll. And he knows because he went and saw them live. And, he broke the segregation rules and would go see them live and go appeal to both black and whites all over the place with his, trying to copy their music because he loved black music. And at a time when music was incredibly segregated. So he was an incredible integrationist without even realizing it at a time when the powers that be were trying to keep things as segregated as possible. So he was radical in that way for his time in the 1950s. And there's another way he was radical was the fact that the head of the American Indian movement, a guy named John Trudell, who had horrible things happen to his family when he was protesting in a major way. After he lost his whole family in a fire, when he set fire to a flag on the steps of Congress in the 70s, he ended up going into music. He gave up activism, wrote an album's worth of music, and Jackson Browne produced it. It was called Graffiti Man, and he had a song called Baby Che about Elvis Presley. He called Elvis the Che Guevara of the 1950s, of his generation, and he said that because he said he revolutionized us men to free our emotions, to express our emotions so deeply for the first time. And that's the way he felt about Elvis. So Elvis was actually radical without realizing in that way, too, in the way he expressed emotions like no other man's done before. And so, here was the CIA trying to control people's hearts and minds. And here was this young 21-year-old who was loved throughout the country. And they tried to censor him throughout the country. And youth would actually throw rocks through the windows of radio stations saying, you better play Elvis or we're going to tear this town up. And so that's the effect Elvis was having. And who comes into his life? A guy named Colonel Tom Parker. He was the highest level National Reserves officer. And I show how the National Reserves have been used for many special operations. And so starting in 1956, Colonel Tom Parker, according to biographers, would start giving him uppers and downers regularly. And that's when he started getting addicted to the uppers and downers. And then in 1958, he's drafted into the Army, and he goes over to Germany where they're running many MKUltra operations. And he's surrounded by a group that stays with him the rest of his life, who they end up calling the Memphis Mafia. But they constantly encourage his continued use of the uppers and downers and end up killing him. But Colonel Tom Parker did not let him do a live concert for 10 years straight. That's how much this Tom Parker controlled his life. And now they asked John Lennon, when Presley died in the 70s, they hounded John Lennon for a comment about Elvis's death. And Lennon finally said, I just, look, to me, Elvis died when he went to Germany in 1958. He was great before then, but when he went into Germany, into the war, after that, he was just the living dead. And so that's what a lot of people see Elvis. He was completely controlled after, from about 1958 on, because he was so addicted to these drugs.
Yeah, what a heartbreak. And I know earlier you talked a little bit about the Kennedy brothers, and you just talked about Che Guevara as well. You have cover images of both Robert Kennedy, Che Guevara on your book. Again, they weren't known to have used any of the drugs. How do they relate to the theme of this book? Yeah,
they relate for several reasons. I talked a little about Kennedy before, but I'll tell a little bit more in a moment. But Che Guevara was on that hit list for the psychedelic hit list to be dosed with acid. They were going to use different means, and they were going to try to aerosolize acid and get him that way. And but another reason he was targeted, reason he's on the cover of the book and was targeted, was because the CIA saved thousands of Nazis to be their assets and agents down in South America and Central America. And that's been documented in the past few years. New York Times has come out with, an understanding of, different estimates between 5,000 and 10,000 Nazis were saved by the CIA to do their bidding, supposedly to help in the Cold War against Russia and all that. But anyway, so those agents down in those areas were found to be helping cultivate the cocaine trafficking networks to fight against any leftists and to lead what they end up calling cocaine coups, like the one Klaus the Butcher of Leon Barbie led in Bolivia in 1980, where I got a picture of that someone took of a Nazi flag flying in the Andes in the Bolivian mountains. And so Klaus Barbie was enlisted by the CIA to hunt down Che Guevara in 1967, and films about Che Guevara's death, show that. People say, yes, Klaus Barbie led battalions to hunt down Che Guevara and kill him. And so that's some of the connections with him, with the drugs as weapons against us. But with the Kennedys, with Robert Kennedy, besides the fact that RFK was trying to, shut down MK Ultra, had clamped down on the mafia that were working with the CIA on the cocaine trafficking and the opium trafficking, Marcello family down in New Orleans, the Genovese family in New York, mafia families. He also, RFK's wife, got convinced to go through LSD therapy with a counselor before it became illegal. And then at the time of his death, RFK's death, he was very against the Vietnam War, and I show that one of the biggest reasons for the Vietnam War was to gain control of the poppy fields around the Golden Triangle of opium growing around Vietnam. But also, a Harvard psychiatrist analyzed Sirhan Sirhan for 6 hours within the past, say, a few years. He went and analyzed them, and he says that Sirhan Sirhan was hypnotized to do what he did, and he doesn't remember anything of what he did. And MK Ultra showed part of their program was the use of hypnosis to hypnotize people to do their bidding, and they used psychohypnotic drugs to enhance that hypnosis to get them to do things that were incredibly violent, such as they used psychohypnotic drugs such as Tuinals and Secanols to help get them to do that.
And using the drugs in a form of hypnosis, they were actually able to get people to go outside of that. I thought hypnosis would keep you from, or hypnosis would not, how do I want to put this? Sure. That you would not act outside of your normal capacity through hypnosis. Yeah,
well, I have documentation of different, there was a ABC documentary that interviewed a consultant to the CIA who was a psychologist who said that, yes, using the right techniques and the right drugs and enough time, he could get people to act outside of their normal, values and do violent things such as kill a person. So, it's different consultants to the CIA have said this can be done. And top people, even like this Harvard psychiatrist, said, yes, this could have been done with Sirhan Sirhan. He believes it was done with Sirhan Sirhan.
We have 2 minutes left in this segment, and we're going to go to open phone lines. How was the Occupy Wall Street movement targeted with regards to the drugs?
Yeah, well, different ways. I mean, the government documents came out that through Freedom of Information Act about the fact that different Occupy Wall Street leaders were targeted, even with death plans, death operations. And the FBI, when they find out about death plans to kill people, they're supposed to warn those people. They're supposed to act on that information, but they didn't. They didn't warn these Occupy leaders. And so it also showed that the FBI was actually working with Wall Street banks and Wall Street people about how to oppose these Occupy activists. And but the biggest thing in relation to drugs is the fact that some filmmakers found in Minneapolis that the Occupy leaders, Occupy activists in Minneapolis who were being kind of bribed and led by police away from their encampment area and brought to a warehouse, and they filmed this happening from afar. And then they interviewed these people after they came back from going with the police, and these people have said, police took me to some warehouse, they got me high on incredibly strong weed and on synthetic weed, they called Spice and K2, and there was loads of people there being, given all these drugs. They offered me to pay me back if I got other drugs. They offered me all kinds of stuff to do all kinds of things, and then they interrogated me with all kinds of questions about the Occupy movement, their plans, and different people involved, etc. And so they called that film that they posted on YouTube, they called it MK Occupy, obviously after MK Ultra, thinking that same tactics were used, as MK Ultra in the Occupy movement.
Wow.
And so that's just some of the ways that they were being targeted with drugs.
Well, we'll open up phone lines when we return from the top of the hour. If you have questions, thoughts, and input for John Potash, you can be a part of the show with us. Drugs as weapons against us. That's the topic tonight on Coast to Coast AM. Our guest this evening, John Potash, did his graduate studies at Columbia University, where he received a master's in social welfare and was mentored by Richard Cloward, one of America's top sociologists. He was the founding publisher of an award-winning national graduate school newspaper, Social Justice Action Quarterly. Potash published his first book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. And Potash has been featured on C-SPAN's American History TV and has been interviewed on dozens of radio shows and radio stations around the U.S. and abroad. His work has also been published in the Baltimore Chronicle, the City Paper, Covert Action Quarterly, Rock Creek Free Press, and Z Magazine. He has worked counseling people with mental health issues and addictions for over 25 years. His book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendricks, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. That's been our topic. Phone lines are open if you have questions or your thoughts about tonight's topic. This is when you want to give us a buzz. We'll be back. We've got your calls next on Coast to Coast AM. We are here. This is Coast to Coast AM, the best in overnight talk radio, and I'm your host, Dave Schrader. My guest this evening, John Potash. We're talking about his book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. Are you ready to take some phone calls?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah.
All right, let's get to it. We've got east of the Rockies, Leo in Lenord, Texas. Welcome to the show.
Hi. I was going to ask John if he's heard of any ketamine experiments in the U.S. Army Fort Hood area.
I heard of. I haven't heard of specific experiments in Fort Hood, but I know during the MK Ultra era that they tested many drugs, more than 1,000 Edgewood Arsenal soldiers, and particularly LSD. But and then studied them, asked them questions 19 years later about how they affected them, and at least 25% of those soldiers said that after even 19 years they still had negative adverse effects from LSD. But I believe that they tested drugs on soldiers in other places besides just Edgewood Arsenal. So it's certainly possible they could have done experiments at Fort. I just don't know.
There was a small epidemic of it.
Really? Wow.
All right, Leo, thank you for calling in. I do have an email here, and he says, by the way, I do have a friend who used to regularly participate in the clinical studies on ecstasy at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. She was paid per session to take the drug. And then he says, can you please ask the guest what he thinks of Dave McGowan's book on Laurel Canyon musicians, the scenes linked to the CIA, drugs, and all the coincidental suicides in that scene?
Yeah, I appreciate her asking that because I think Dave McGowan did very interesting research, and so I include his work in about at least 6 pages, if not 12 pages, but maybe half those pages might be the end notes, but my index says I have about 12 or 14 pages on McGowan, but as I say, half of them are probably referencing some of the end notes I have from his book and his good work. His work is very interesting because he documents how probably at least 24 of top bands in the 60s, American bands, all were living in the same small area of Los Angeles called Laurel Canyon. And he shows how they rose to meteoric fame seemingly out of nowhere in the early to mid-'60s or late '60s. And he documents how many of them had military connections. Either their families were high up in the military, or more often even they were in the military at some point before they became these famous musicians. And except for a few who had these were from families of the wealthiest people in the country. And so he shows these how they then proceeded to be very apolitical and also to be spreading drugs like crazy at some parties. It's hard to describe all he has in there, but it's really fascinating stuff. And it all happened in Laurel Canyon, in this area where there's this Lookout Mountain film studio, which is the Air Force's film studio, a gigantic film studio that had dozens of actors. I mean, you're talking about the biggest name actors doing classified films, and they're not allowed to talk about what the films are. They have to sign a loyalty oath, just like the top military research people, that they can't say what they're working on, and that thousands and thousands of films came out of this studio, which we don't know if these are some mainstream films or not, but when you got these top actors acting in them, obviously they probably are. So it's such a strange community, intermingling with these people working for the Air Force, these top actors working for the Air Force, also going to these parties where there's drug and sex parties in the 60s, and they're being somewhat orchestrated by some of these musicians that have these strong military ties, coming right out of the military or families high up in the military, and they're passing out drugs like crazy and getting so many people to come to these parties and do drugs. So it's really quite a story. I think McGowan did such great work, and it's very sad that now he's in the hospital with, I think, what I understand is stage 4 cancer. But he did some great research, I think, yeah.
Let's go to west of the Rockies. Aaron in New Mexico. Welcome to Coast AM.
Hey, yeah, I had a question or more of a comment for John. He just said that Courtney Love introduced Kurt Cobain to heroin, but I watched the documentary about Kurt Cobain, Montage of Heck, and it said that he used heroin in 1987.
Yeah, no, I didn't say she introduced it to him. I said that in Montage of Heck, they did a good job. Overall, I think the film doesn't cover what it needs to cover about Kurt Cobain's death, but I did a good job in saying exactly what you said. From 1987 to 1990, his diary said he tried heroin about six times because he had this massive stomach problem, and that was the only thing that cured him of his pain, he said. But she's the one that got him doing it daily, is what I said. Yeah, that not that she introduced it to him now, but that she got him doing it daily. And many people, friends of his, are quoted in a book called Our Town about the Seattle music scene, saying that he was not using heroin daily until she came into his life and got him using it daily.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Let's go now to the first-time caller line. We've got Tom in Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Hey, great show. I had a couple comments. You brought up some things that brought back some memories. I was at Homestead Air Base in the late 60s, 67, and I'd run into some people, an individual that had a bad experience with LSD. Mm-hmm. And he was hospitalized, and he had been down 30 days, and they didn't know whether they were going to get him back or not. And I was always suspicious. And from that time on, I never fooled with any of the psychedelic drugs.
Good for you.
And I was in the scene in the 60s, but they also had planes down there that would land, and they were supposed to be they were the C-150s, I think, or C-5As. They were coming in for with body bags, and they had hundreds of bags, from Vietnam, and it was odd because they put a heavy guard on these things on the flight line, and they would sit there for sometimes 8, 10, 12 hours. And, we used to talk about it all the time there, that, there was something very suspicious about what was going on. Later found out, years later, that was how they were getting the opium and the heroin back in.
Yeah, I've heard other accounts of people saying that too.
So, I was there when they were doing it, so I kind of knew, from that time on that, the government was heavily involved in this stuff. And later on, at that time there, I was actually approached by someone belonging to I can't really say the organization, but they were outside. They were outside of all this stuff, and they wanted some help. And I really wasn't in a position to do anything. But after I ended up through the war, the anti-war demonstrations, I was at D.C. when they were passing out acid free, which is unheard of. It's stuff you're talking about back then, $5 a hit, and they were giving this stuff away at demonstrations, and we knew. Wow. Don't take this stuff. This is what the admonition was, even from the stage. The government totally disrupted the anti-war movement through, and at that particular demonstration was the biggest one, May Day in 1971. And I ended up located in Kent State a few years later. And I ran into some people. I kept tripping over people, and I was sort of aimed. Again, I was approached, and I did some analyzing work for these people, and they were sort of aiming me in directions. And I ended up tripping over information on the Kent State murders, and it was unbelievable what I'd found out. But the head of the guard, you mentioned that they were using the National Guard people, and they did. They used them at Kent State. And what they did, they compromised the head of the guard, and then they used, pushed him in the corner where he had to agree to allow the operation to go forward. In my understanding, it was from Army intelligence that started, was running this, and they used the bikers, the outlaws. I met the head of the outlaws, the president, and they actually took his children away when this stuff hit the press and hit those trials in Cleveland. They took his children away from him, because they didn't want him open running his mouth, and he had dropped out, and he was the only person that ever walked away from being a president of the outlaw group at that point in time, and the biker gang, and he went totally religious, and he was just freaked out, but he would never open up, but I had one of his relatives open up to him about it, and it was all related to what they had done for Army intelligence in Kent State to facilitate the murders there and get this whole thing going. They started the riots in Kent State, and then the students come out of the bars, and then they drove away. It was just like it was in the Michener novel. It was actually true. They were going out one end of town while the state police were coming in, and the riot squads were coming in the other end of Kent State. So, this whole thing was a real setup, and then eventually I got into the attic where the people were housed, that were the activists who were there at Kent State, and I found the phone taps. They were still in place. All the wiring was still in place years later, and this was several years later, 3, 4, 5 years later. And the attic had never been gone into from that point on. But I got in for service work and accidentally tripped over this. I kept tripping over all of this information. And one of the guys that was in the National Guard was a friend of mine. And he was approached, but he didn't want to get involved. And he was there at Kent State when that went down, but he wasn't one of the people given live ammunition. So he talked about it, and I kept falling through all this stuff and getting this information, and it was really, really ridiculous what had been done. But it's everything you were saying tonight just opened up old memories, because I'm almost 67 years old now. But this stuff was 50 years ago, some of it, and it's still.
Thanks so much for telling about all this.
Yeah, and thank you, Tom. We appreciate the call.
Hey, thank you for opening this up tonight.
You bet. When you hear something like that, I mean, how does that make you feel as somebody who's been researching this and getting this, and you're hearing from people that had feet on the ground and
it's
can
pretty
corroborate
amazing that he did great. He just gave great accounts of so many different things that I actually cover in my book. That support, what he said too from other witnesses that said similar stuff, and so it's amazing that he just witnessed so much of this personally. So it's really, really great. Thanks so much for that account.
Let's go to wildcard line 1, Barbara in Arizona. Welcome to Coast AM.
Hi, thank you for taking the call.
Sure.
I was in Chicago with Students for Democratic Society. I'm also an old hippie. On the other end of it, not in the military, but on the
Good for you for being
anti-war
involved with
and
SDS.
civil rights. Knew the Black Panthers, Freddie Hampton. But I saw Timothy Leary speak in 1977. And I also, years later, became friends with a woman whose husband was the psychiatrist for Richard Alpert Ramdas, who was the cohort at Harvard. And then I really looked at his, if you look at Timothy Leary's being in the military, studying psychology in the military during World War II, going on with his entire dissertation on the social dimensions of personality, group structure, and process in 1947. His whole thing was about manipulating people, and she confirmed my suspicions, which I'd always had, that he was a CIA agent. I mean, if you just read the Wikipedia and read between the lines and who he was associated with and where he got his education and ended up with Richard Alpert and actually manipulating them. Her husband, the woman I met, her husband was his psychiatrist, and she said to me in the early 60s that he was talking to her about LSD. She was in her 80s when she told me this. Manipulating people, using drugs, and really disheartening the ban the bomb and the movement, and getting involved with using this to just destroy the anti-war movement and on. And even in the early 60s with the ban the bomb before the Vietnam, and that all came out of the anti-McCarthy people. So I mean, he was in World War II, but he didn't go into action. He studied psychology and how to manipulate the human mind.
Thanks for that account. I appreciate
thank you very much, Barbara, for calling in.
Side. He was CIA.
And he's admitted in interviews too. But thanks for that other part of his history. It's interesting. I don't get into as much detail on that part of his history, so thanks for giving that.
Let's go to wildcard line 2. Mahat in New York City. You've got about 2 minutes here with us in this segment.
Yes,
what would you like to say?
Very quickly, great show.
Thank you.
And the first part is reflect on Marley, Bob Marley, who is alleged to have been murdered, Michael Jackson, and Biggie when you returned from the break. Point of clarification, Matula Shakur, who right up in the Bronx had a method acupuncture of eliminating addictions, is still in prison, like a lot of former Black Panthers. But my main question is, how does your work and research tie in, John, to the Southern strategy of Nixon and Reagan, where blacks and people of color became the targets under the rubric of the war on drugs and a whole prison mass incarceration complex that is essentially in many ways, per the 13th Amendment, equivalent to slavery, and echoes works like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And I'll listen over the air as you guys return. Thank you so much for this program.
Thank you very much. Do you have a quick answer for that? We've got a break coming up.
I just got to say some great callers. I don't know where you find these callers. They're excellent. Yeah, she just outlined a lot of the chapters I didn't get a chance to talk about as much. I do quote Michelle Alexander in one chapter because that's, I argue, I show how the war on drugs is actually turned into a war on us with the use of drugs, and particularly communities of color. And, there's a lot of evidence that the cocaine trafficking networks that were fostered in Latin America, and then some of these same people that were used as operatives in Jamaica, like the Jamaican posse that admitted, some of these people admitted that they were paid by the CIA to shoot Bob Marley before he was going to hold a concert, which was going to be considered as a supportive concert for the socialist Prime Minister Michael Manley, who was against the CIA backed opponent of Manley at that time. Marley ended up dying at the hands of the CIA. He was.
We have to take a break. We'll come back. We'll talk more with John Potash. You're listening to the best in overnight talk radio. This is Coast to Coast AM. My guest this evening, John Potash. We're taking your calls. John, our last caller threw a lot out at you before we went to the break. I want to make sure that we get a chance to answer those questions before we take another call. And we had to cut you off a little short when you were talking about Bob Marley, so feel free to jump back in, maybe catch us up a little bit on where we were going with that.
Thanks, Dave. So some of these gunmen that had shot Bob Marley and his wife, Rita Marley, and his manager, Don Taylor. It turns out Don Taylor came out in his memoir saying that some Rastafarians caught the gunmen, and they admitted that the CIA paid them to to shoot Marley. And so I found, Gary Webb, the great researcher on the cocaine trafficking with the Iran-Contra crack cocaine issue. He wrote those articles for the San Jose Mercury News, and then came out with a book of a compilation of those articles that was a book called Dark Alliance. He said that in that book that some of these CIA assets in Jamaica that shot Marley, that admitted, were being paid by the CIA to shoot Marley, then came into the New York community, settled in Brooklyn, and were used on the East Coast in general in the kind of U.S. intelligence network of cocaine trafficking around there. And then, of course, they had the CIA assets on the West Coast with Freeway Ricky Ross, from the Iran-Contra, the Contra army in Nicaragua that was fighting against the Socialist Sandinistas. They were trafficking cocaine also to the West Coast. So the CIA had different assets that were involved. And Congresswoman Maxine Waters said that this cocaine was being targeted into the black communities. Loads of other research and eyewitnesses and everything else showed that the opium was being in the 60s that were brought in from the Vietnam area was coming into the black communities just after the riots, the civil rights riots of the 60s. And so it appears that the communities of color were being particularly targeted with these drugs, and they were, people were getting arrested for the dealing and use and possession and all that, and that tactic still seems to be happening to this day, where there's this mass incarceration based on drugs, and people that get felonies for anything related to drugs end up being kind of what we call disenfranchised. They can't vote, they can't run for office, they can't be involved politically hardly at all, and it's hard for them to get jobs, of course, and it's really disenfranchising huge percentages of people of color when drugs gets into their community so much, with the evidence that's coming from the U.S. intelligence networks. So that answers that part of it. But the issue about Biggie is that he appeared to be more collateral damage just because of who Tupac was, and Tupac befriended him and tried to help him. But then they made up this East Coast versus West Coast kind of war. And evidence shows that they set up, Black Panther leaders against each other in the 60s, including Afeni Shakur when she was in New York against Huey Newton when he was in California, with fake letters and undercover agents spreading gossip and rumors and tried to pretend like there's a war between them. But all the evidence appears to show that was only undercover agents that were actually killing some of these Panthers in this war, and they weren't actually killing each other over this stuff. So the same things appear to happen with the Tupac versus Biggie issue. And
how strange.
Yeah.
Let's take our final break. We'll come back. We've got more calls and an email on tap right here on Coast to Coast AM. Thank you very much for hanging in with me for the evening. I'm Dave Schrader. This is Coast to Coast AM. John Potash, my guest. John, here's an email. Hi, Dave. Just listening to your show, and by coincidence, I've just started listening to archives of Mae Brussel. Can you ask your guest if he has heard of her? I'd never heard of her before until I stumbled upon a video 2 nights ago. It seems she's made hundreds of radio shows throughout the 70s and 80s, and I was listening to a show she had made 6 days after John Lennon was murdered, and she spoke a lot about the deaths of music artists and the connection with the CIA. Just thought I'd bring this to your attention as your guest may have something to say on May. Kind regards. That's Terry Walsh, who wrote in from Liverpool.
It's funny because the first book review I got of my book was because I sent it to a guy a friend who was who loves Mae Brussels, and so he reviewed two books, a book that came out when my manuscript was about to come out, and he reviewed Mae Brussels, a collection of Mae Brussels essays that were turned into, that were taken from her radio programs and turned into written essays, and also reviewed my book and showed how similar they were in research and theories. And I've come across Mae Brussels during my research, and I think her work's great. She did mostly radio work, but her work was really groundbreaking, and a lot of people have been inspired by her. And she says a number of the same things that I say with the targeting of musicians with drugs and targeting musicians for their activist work, and she has a lot of great stuff in her work. It's just that since it was more radio work than it was written work, she doesn't have all the endnotes and documentation on paper as much as I do, though her new work that's been translated into print, I haven't gotten a chance to get the book yet, but I look forward to doing that to see if Alex Constantine, the editor of that compilation, has tried to find endnotes for it in some way, shape, or form.
All right, let's go back to the phone lines. Wild card, line 3. Bobby in Northwest Alabama. You're on Coast to Coast AM.
Good morning, Dave. Good morning, John. How are you this morning?
Good.
Great. Thanks for calling in.
I'm going to take you guys. I've got some inside information on some activities that we've kind of been talking about, but I've got to take you back a little bit in time. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember a city that used to be called, had the name of Little Las Vegas back in the 1950s in the state of Alabama?
No.
Oh, no, I'm not familiar with
You're
that.
familiar with Phoenix City, Alabama?
Okay.
Phoenix City, Alabama there was a movie that was done about Phoenix City, Alabama, and it was literally the main street of downtown. And incidentally, Phoenix City is right across the river from Columbus, Georgia, and the large military base there. Literally on Main Street of Phoenix City, Alabama, you had every kind of gambling hall that you could possibly find, wide open for everyone to see. Mafia galore in Phoenix City, Alabama. A gentleman by the name of, let me think now, it was a gentleman that was practicing attorney in that particular city that was opposed to the gambling actions going on there, and he ran for Attorney General of the state of Alabama. And when he was elected Attorney General of the state of Alabama, on the very night, he was assassinated by members of the mafia. But his son, who was also a licensed attorney, was appointed by the new governor of the state of Alabama as Attorney General, and he cleaned out all of the mafia that was coming in, that was in Phoenix City, and all of that mafia started going north. Now, I know you've got to have heard about the county up in Tennessee that was the famous county where Sheriff Buford Pusser lived. Do you know who does the name Sheriff Buford Pusser? There were 3 movies done about him.
Yeah, I've heard of his name, and I think I've maybe seen one of his movies way back when.
Right. Well, the mafia, the way it ended up in across the Mississippi, across the state line from Corinth, Mississippi, just up there in the Tennessee, McNairy County. The way it ended up there was it was all run up there, as they were moving north and kind of northwest. Well, it made a pit stop also. Some of them were making little pit stops along the way, and I'm not going to name what exact part of northwest Alabama that the pit stop made, but it made a pit stop in my little section of northwest Alabama. Within just a matter of a few years, a town that had a airport that had a grass runway that could accommodate nothing but single-engine traffic when they finally did build a 3,000-foot long paved runway there. Wasn't all that long. Drugs started coming in on the city streets, and just drugs. And about during the late 70s, when they were just as plentiful as they could be, suddenly we needed an airport in this county. And I live in a very rural county, but we needed a brand new airport. Didn't have enough property to where the municipally owned, or by the county, I guess, airport was. So we went out into the country. Out in the country, bought what used to be cow pastures out there, and we built a runway that could land twin engines and even twin-engine jets. And we had to put not only runway lights out there, but it had to have a rotating beacon. Only thing is it's only certain times that those lights come on, and I live within distance of seeing those lights at that airport. As a matter of fact, I'm less than 1 mile as the crow flies from that airport. For many, many years, there were nighttime flights that were spoken about that landed at that airport. One way that prescription drugs were getting onto the streets of not just this county, but the counties surrounding us, is they were coming out of the hospitals in this county. And as a matter of fact, back then, not every hospital had a little small rural hospital didn't always have a registered pharmacist in the pharmacy of the hospital, and that was the case for our little county hospital. We had an old retired doctor that run it with LPNs. And one of the LPNs turned and made a telephone call to the DEA in Birmingham, Alabama, and advised the DEA that all of the controlled substances that were being ordered by and I won't name the doctors' names, but I know them, doctors in this town, and this was all going out onto the streets. Well, before the DEA could investigate it, now every bit of this you can Google online for yourself. That nurse had a bomb planted in her car, and it was planted so that it would go off when she turned on her turn signal.
Wow.
Now they didn't think that she'd use her turn signal driving out of the parking lot that she had her car parked in right there at the hospital, but she did. And it blew parts of her body, and her car were found on the roofs of surrounding buildings.
Oh, my God.
And all of this, let's fast forward now to the 90s. And this isn't just in Alabama, but in the 90s, in other states around the country, but especially in the South and Florida in particular, the doctors, all these pain clinics that were popping up here and there and yonder, where, and drugs this, drugs that. And, when OxyContin became hillbilly heroin, people would drive down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, buy it in bulk and bring it back and sell it for 15 times what it was worth. But now, friends, the government has got us all hooked on drugs. Everybody, and that's not just drug addicts. There's people that are in chronic pain. I have relatives that are in chronic pain that have to legitimately take narcotics. Within the last year, multiple states in the Southeast, including the states that I know firsthand of, Alabama and Tennessee, I know firsthand, and that's information you can look up on the internet as well. The medical boards of those states are coming down on the doctors that are writing these medicines. They're telling these doctors, you have to get these people down to a floorboard level on their medication. I've crushed my hip, not broke it, crushed it in November. And I was talking with, it was my orthopedic doctor, and incidentally, the orthopedic doctor I used is the same doctor that treats the University of Alabama sports systems. I won't name his name because he's not sitting there, but that's easy to find as well. When it comes time, I had to go in a nursing home for 30 days of rehab. We're talking about pain medicine to give to me while I'm doing rehab in a nursing home. They said, we've got going to write you some Percocet 10s. I said, buddy, I've had dental problems. I've had this, that. I said, Percocet 10s are not going to cut it for me with a crushed hip. I've been having to hit the morphine pump like it's going out of style. He said, I said, can you write me like some Demerol tablets or some? He said, we can't write that stuff anymore. I said, I've got a hip that has been crushed, and you're telling me that you can't write me for 1 month Demerol? Okay, point being, the government and the mafia have gotten this country in the drug establishment that we're in, and now the powers that be are coming down on to shut off what they're wanting to shut the faucet off now. What's the deal? You know, I mean, you want to talk about.
Well, let's let him answer that. Thanks a lot for calling in, Bobby. There is something to that. Obviously, we're a drug country. You hear commercials all the time for everything: uppers, downers, happy pills, sad pills. You know, everything's out there. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I don't. You know, my book would have gotten way too large to cover pharmaceuticals and legal drugs, but so someone else can write that book, I guess. You know, actually, I've seen books about that a little bit. You know, the unpublished manuscripts, but nonetheless, some of the stuff he touched on is interesting. One thing is he talked about an attorney general being killed, and in 1990, it was 1991, I talked to former Attorney General Ramsey Clark, and he was Attorney General under Kennedy and Johnson, and I asked him about what he thought about the way government uses drugs, and he said, I think government uses drugs to sedate and divide the masses. And so he was in the know, obviously. But in terms of the connection between mafia and U.S. intelligence and, you know, government's U.S. intelligence, there's, you know, just loads of examples of that. The way William Pepper says U.S. intelligence uses mafia as their front men in terms of, you know, lower level drug trafficking, but also to put, in terms of assassinations, to put a level of denial between themselves and the actual hit of, you know, important people. And they've used the mafia that way many times, besides just using the mafia for helping with the drug trafficking. But in terms of the pain pills and the proliferation of them, you know, obviously all of that opium coming out of first the Golden Triangle in Vietnam area, and now the tons, even higher levels of opium coming out of the Golden Crescent around Afghanistan with our troops stationed there. It's not just going to be used for heroin; it's also going to be used for pain pills often, and the pain pills were running amok in the streets. And I would be counseling kids that would say, well, I first took it as pain pills recreationally. But then that wasn't enough as my tolerance grew, and I got into heroin after that. And I heard that again and again. You know, I've constantly heard that story. And so it seems that there's a connection there too. You know, it's all opiates. But I don't know. There is competing forces, and some honest DEA there are trying to clamp down. But then there's also, an over clamping down, I guess, for people that have legitimate pain. So it's interesting. I'm not sure what the motive for the clamping down is exactly. It may be, a well-meaning motive, or it could be something else. I don't know.
We have a minute left together. What do you really hope people get out of the book that you put together here?
Well, I most hope that they just learn the government's tactics in order to help save, our current leaders, help them become their own independent leaders, and to help save people's minds and save people's lives from this us all being fooled and duped into thinking like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll is the way to have fun. You can have the sex and the rock and roll without the drugs, and enjoy yourself. And I hope people just, learn and wise up on that, because, in a perfect world, do whatever you want with your life with drugs and all, but it's not a perfect world. We've got fascist oligarchical forces continuing to keep us in constant war and polluting our environment, and it's affecting us all, and it's time to, change that.
John, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Get the book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. I also want to thank first hour guest Brad Meltzer, his book, The President's Shadow. I want to thank Nathan and Gina back in the home office holding things down for us. Tim Dennis, my engineer and best buddy here in Minnesota. George Norrie, of course, and Lisa Lyon. I'll be back with you on August 1st. Thank you very much for tuning in. Be kind to one another, love one another, and have a great night. This is the best in overnight talk radio. You've been listening to Coast AM.